Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about the infamous Big Van Vader from Dark Side of the Ring. So, what an amazing episode of Dark Side of the Ring. This is actually one of my favorite episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. Vader is one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. Just really a big fan. I'm not going to give an entire rundown of the episode, but I will give my thoughts to the episode as well as sort of extend some conversation points. So they talked about him breaking into the business. He played in the NFL for a short time. He was injured. And then he meets, they said Bruiser Brody, and he was sent to Minnesota. What they didn't mention is that he was trained by Brad Rheingans. Brad Rheingans was one of the co-trainers with Verne Gagne up in the AWA. Brad Rheingans is responsible for so many people, one of whom is actually Brock Lesnar. If you actually go and look at all the people that was trained by Verne Gagne and Brad Rheingans specifically, it is a who's who Hall of Fame number of talent. I mean, just listen to this. This is from Wrestling Data. He trained Brock Lesnar, Kurt Hennig, Curtis Axel, Jake the Snake Roberts, Bradshaw, JBL, Medusa, Rick Steiner, Scott Norton, Vader. I mean, just so many people was trained in that system with Brad Rheingans. It's just tremendous. And he's one of the most unsung heroes in all of pro wrestling. I don't know if he's dead or not. I mean, maybe I should look that up. But he is, you can almost guarantee you're going to see the name Brad Rheingans so many times when you talk about great wrestlers being in this business. He's tremendous, and he should get more credit. So Vader debuted in the AWA in 1986 using the nickname Baby Bull. He also used the name Bull Power. Baby Bull, of course, if you watch Dark Side of the Ring, you know, is a nickname he got in college playing football. But he was kind of a white meat babyface. He was a babyface for the most part, and he also worked heel a little bit. It wasn't until 1987 when he got the invitation to go to New Japan, where, of course, his career went straight up. That's where he got the Big Van Vader gimmick. The Big Van Vader gimmick, as they mentioned in Dark Side of the Ring, is actually based on an old samurai who went by the name Date Masamune. And he was also the inspiration for Darth Vader in Star Wars. So that's why, the name Vader kind of clicks. But the gimmick itself was designed by Jushin Thunder Liger. He designed the costume, he designed the headset, all of that. And this is important because New Japan Pro Wrestling later on would claim ownership of the gimmick. Now, they allowed him to use it in WCW. But when he wanted to go to a different wrestling promotion, especially when he wanted to leave New Japan in 1993, he ended up getting sued by New Japan as they claimed that they owned the gimmick. And they forced him to change his name to Super Vader. Now, this will become an important thing later as, of course, Vince McMahon is most known for trying to change his name to the Mastodon, right? To something that they could copyright in WWE. But here is a copyright issue with this same guy using this same name in 1993 before he even came to WWE. But the issue was that he was offered $2.5 million in a 4-year deal with UWFI. This is according to the Wrestling Observer newsletter, which is about $625,000 per year. That's what he was offered to jump ship from New Japan to UWFI. And of course he did it, but it required that he had to change his name. So he started wrestling there under the name Super Vader. It's interesting that in the Dark Side of the Ring, they talked about his mentors being Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody, because those guys always worked stiff. And that's the seed that they're planting to show you that he came up with guys who worked stiff. He worked in Japan, and UWFI was one of these quote-unquote shoot promotions that everything was a work, but it was supposed to be like a shoot promotion. And he worked stiff there too. And they basically was telling you about how Vader worked stiff. And of course, he had always been rewarded for working stiff. So that's who he was. That's how he knew how to present the character. That's what the Japanese liked. And then also that's what some Americans liked, but they didn't always like that. Of course, he jumped ship to WCW in 1990. He was recruited by Jim Ross, as mentioned in Dark Side of the Ring, and he went on a parade of injuring people. In 1992, he broke Joe Thurman's back with a power bomb. Now, the best part of Dark Side of the Ring was his discussion by Joe Thurman about what happened, and that Vader was just reckless with the power bomb. He was also just kind of not caring in the moment. They define this as him sort of getting lost in the character, him trying to make sure that the character is protected, that you believe that what Vader did was legitimate. And, and this is important because, again, he's coming off of this guy who's working in Japan, and it was his job to tear through guys like Antonio Inoki and Tatsumi Fujinami and actually go in there and make it look good. And so he brought that same mentality to WCW, and he ended up coming across as being quite reckless. But him breaking Joe Thurman's back was a central piece of Dark Side of the Ring. They actually brought Joe Thurman out to talk about it. If you actually look at the powerbomb itself, it didn't look particularly reckless. We've seen people take powerbombs like that before. Vader, in a shoot interviews, said that he powerbombed him the same way he powerbombed everyone. And he didn't think there was anything wrong with the powerbomb itself, while Joe Thurman is saying basically he felt that the powerbomb was reckless. So I understand that, but this begins Vader's reputation. He will also break Sting's ribs. That was an important piece because Sting was a top guy in WCW. But they didn't go into any real detail about him giving Cactus Jack a concussion. Now, this was in 1993. They were working on an episode of Saturday Night's WCW, and they agreed to lay it in and that Cactus Jack would take a beating. That was the agreed thing between Cactus Jack and Vader. And what ends up happening is something that got both of them in trouble, as the level of violence that Vader inflicted upon Cactus Jack. And he even took his gloves off for this match, if I remember correctly. And he ended up with Cactus Jack getting a concussion, several facial contusions, and this match ended up being so infamous that TBS got complaints from parents about how violent this match was. Even Dave Meltzer was writing in The Observer about how this match sets a dangerous trend. Let's read some of that real quick. Dave Meltzer writes, quote, "The Vader Cactus Jack main event exemplified what is beginning to turn into a dangerous trend in the business. Not disturbing the fans because they love matches like this. It's disturbing because the element of risk and injury is being flirted with too much too closely when matches get stiff and legitimately brutal as this and other recent matches have turned out to be." Skipping ahead, he continues by saying, "Violence on television has become a major political issue in recent weeks. Luckily for pro wrestling, nobody cares enough about it to where any possible ramifications of Senate hearings aren't going to be applied to its product mix. Besides, any serious wrestling fan shouldn't be nearly as offended by what's fake than by what's real. Without violence, fake or real, there would be no pro wrestling." So he talks about UWF and other wrestling promotions that are sort of mimicking this style. He talks about, a lot of the Daredevil stuff that Sabu was doing, and, the women's wrestling. All of it's just getting very violent and over the top. So this match was worth, I think, spending some time on, and they didn't, because this also is another notch when you talk about Vader being stiff. I mean, you got this guy who broke somebody's back. He broke a top guy's ribs. He's, another kind of sort of top guy. He just beat the shit out of him. He also is the guy who ripped off Mick Foley's ear. This was in Germany in 1994. Foley and Vader were wrestling in Germany. Foley does his spot where his head is caught between the ropes and they're struggling. Foley slides out, and I think that kind of severs his ear. And then him and Vader are wrestling, and Vader used to throw these paws like at your head, and then all of a sudden Foley's ear just falls off, and it was psychotic. It seemed like a Vader match guarantees that somebody was going to get hurt. whether it was Stan Hansen, where Vader's own eye pops out of his head, which is incredibly gross. And they told that story pretty well. Or the fact that Vader is hurting other people, or other people are being hurt in Vader matches. I'm surprised the referees didn't get hurt. But this all, of course, matters as Hulk Hogan is coming in, and Hulk Hogan's a prima donna, and he don't really want to get hit. He don't really want to get hurt. Now, him and Vader worked together quite a few times, and you would think if Vader could survive working with Hulk Hogan, I think they worked 2 or 3 times. As stiff as he worked, it should have been a fine in WWF working with Shawn Michaels, but it was not, as we all know. But they also talked about the fight with Paul Orndorff, which I guess they could not possibly ignore. Orndorff's version of events, if you actually read around the internet, is said to be the accurate version, which is that Vader was basically just being a bully, just kind of disrespecting him because he had nerve damage in one arm, and Vader actually hit him first and all this kind of stuff. It was pretty crazy. Guys get into fights, it happens. But this kind of, again, is one of the things that feeds into his reputation as being sort of unpredictable, being a bully, being a jackass, and kind of makes him less sympathetic. Yes, Dark Side of the Ring has decided that Vader was a good guy in this situation, and as such, he was mistreated by the mean old WWF, of course, skipping over all this other stuff that they did talk about, but they didn't talk about it really in detail. They just kind of smoothed it over. Kind of. But this is why Vader ended up leaving WCW, because he got beat up by Paul Orndorff. And, which is weird because Paul Orndorff is really a man with one arm. That's insane to think that a guy the size of Vader was beat up by Paul Orndorff, and Orndorff only had one arm. Sick. Anyway, I think he filed a lawsuit against WCW or something to that effect, because he was out of the company shortly thereafter, and he had a pretty long-term contract with WCW, so I'm pretty sure he probably sued to get out of that contract. And also, I think Bischoff wanted him to take a pay cut, basically a suspension for getting into the fight. This is from Pro Wrestling Story, so maybe that's what occurred. And he ended up jumping to the WWF, where he was recruited again by Jim Ross, where Jim Ross was bringing in guys like Foley and Vader, guys he worked with in WCW that he knew, trusted, similar to what you see today, where, a producer or an agent or somebody will come in and they'll bring in their friends. And that seemed to be what JR was doing in this situation. He had inroads with these WCW guys, so all of a sudden, here's Mick Foley, here's Steve Austin, here's Vader, all guys he worked with in WCW. Now he's running talent relations, and he's bringing those guys in. And he got 2 out of 3. It should have been 3 out of 3, but 2 out of 3 wasn't pretty bad. Here's the thing that I found very interesting. Vince was willing to go all in on Vader, even had him beat up Gorilla Monsoon, which is great creative, by the way. And he seemed to be building up a Vader-Yokozuna singles match, which looked to be earmarked for WrestleMania 12. And then all of a sudden, it was a 6-man tag out of nowhere. Mainly because I think Yokozuna had gotten so big that he was not really able to have singles matches the way he could a year or 2 before. So they kind of modified that match to make it a 6-man tag, even though I would have preferred Vader versus Yokozuna one-on-one. And it seemed like it was going in that direction. And Vader seemed to be doing very well. And then Shawn Michaels started to politic against him. Clearly, Vader works incredibly stiff. Vader also had issues with hygiene. He wasn't washing his gear. And this was a complaint that it wasn't just Shawn Michaels, it was other people too. I know for a fact that Jake Roberts talked about this as well, that they didn't like working with Vader because he didn't wash his gear. They didn't like working with Vader because he worked stiff. And so it wasn't just Shawn. In the Dark Side of the Ring thing, they made it seem like it was just Shawn that was politicking that Vader worked too stiff. But Bret Hart also said that Vader worked too stiff and that he would sometimes be limping from the ring after working with Vader. And these guys, they don't like the Japanese stuff. The WWF guys, also, when you have to take this into account, they worked more than the WCW guys and the Japanese wrestling guys. They were on the road a lot more than those guys. So Vader's beatings the beatings that he could put on guys, you're talking about taking that stuff a lot more often, you know, and you don't want that, So while it makes sense that Vader was able to survive a prima donna like Hulk Hogan, why would, Shawn Michaels have, or Bret Hart or anybody else who might have complained, why would they matter? But when you consider that Vader is working house shows with these guys too, and he's probably working the exact same way at house shows as he's working on TV, because the idea is to keep the character elevated, the idea is to keep the character strong, then yeah, I could see why people would be like, you know what, no mas, I'm not doing this. This guy's killing us in there. Anyway, of course he was earmarked to be the WWF champion. Even the marketing and the promotions and everything, they even had a pay-per-view event called It's Time, which obviously meant that Vader was supposed to be the WWF champion at that event, even though I think it ended up being Sid at that event. So Shawn got buried by Jim Cornette and pretty much everybody as being the guy who killed Vader's push in WWF. They even played the infamous kick in the head where Shawn, who was out of his mind, and I'm extremely surprised that he got away with this, which actually tells you a lot about Vader, is that, despite the fact that he had that reputation for being a bully, somebody tough, legitimate, big, tough guy like Paul Orndorff, even with one arm, is able to beat his ass. But then you had a waif like Shawn Michaels, who felt, comfortable enough that he could just kick Vader in the head 3 times and call him a big fat piece of shit and all that stuff. I mean, that's just crazy talk right there, It's insane that he was that comfortable, thinking that he wasn't going to get killed by this man. But, Vader had a reputation, and the reputation was gone at this point. He had been beat up by Paul Orndorff in a shoot fight that everybody saw. And then Shawn Michaels made him look like a fool on television. So there was no aura to the Big Van Vader character anymore. And that pretty much was the end of it. And they showed him, and the crazy thing is, I heard a lot about Vader being a jabroni. And look, I understand that he lost to a lot of guys in the later part of his career, but it wasn't like immediate, because Vader beat Undertaker, I think, at the Royal Rumble that the next couple of months later. He worked the pay-per-view main event with Sid at, what event was that? Buried Alive, I think it was, where Sid and Vader had a number 1 contenders match to see who was going to wrestle Shawn at Survivor Series. And I think that's when Vince made the decision to go with Sid over Vader. But Vader was still in the mix at that time. He still main evented other pay-per-views. He main evented Final 4, which was the pay-per-view that they had in February of 97. That was for the WWF title. That ended up being won by Bret Hart. But he was still in the mix for a while there. And then the Kane thing happened. Once they found their own monster heel in Kane, they didn't need Vader anymore. That's when they did the whole thing with Vader getting hit in the head with the wrench and him saying that he's a big fat piece of shit, which now we know from Dark Side of the Ring. Gerald Briscoe said that Vince told him to say that. And I guess the idea was that he was going to go away for a while and get his weight together. And that never happened, because Vader fell into what I call the offensive lineman paradox. Now, in football, you can't be 125 pounds to be an offensive lineman or a defensive tackle or nothing like that. It just simply is not going to work. So they want you to be 280, 250 or whatever. But you can't be 600 pounds, right? You still have to have some level of athleticism. The WWE, Vince McMahon, they have this issue with guys. And we've seen it with Keith Lee, Mark Henry, Rikishi, Umaga, again and again. These guys who are pushed as super monsters, these guys are big, but they're supposed to be big and athletic. And once you're big and your athleticism starts to suffer, Vince thinks that you're fat, and then all of a sudden he sends you off to a fat camp somewhere. And that happened to Vader. And Jim Ross told the story of Vader and Yokozuna essentially being sent to the same fat camp, and they were sneaking in buckets of chicken. And this is a story he's told for 20 years. It's amazing that these guys did not take their careers seriously enough, and they had serious food addiction. But now we know that Vader also had painkiller addiction. He also had a drinking problem that they didn't discuss, but that he also talked about, which is what led to his fight with Paul Orndorff, is that he was drinking and he had a bad attitude. And that bad attitude, of course, is what led to the situation in Kuwait, which they discussed and I thought was pretty well covered. That he got into it with a Kuwaiti reporter. Vader claims in an interview that he was just doing what he was told, that he was instructed, but he didn't say who, I'm guessing people at the TV station, to make this a big event, a big moment. And he took the opportunity by the reporter calling wrestling fake to press the reporter and to grab him and basically intimidate the guy. This led to a huge situation. Again, Vader was still working as a top guy in the WWF at the time. He's on this show with Undertaker, who is the world champion. So he's not a complete jabroni yet. But this ain't helping matters. This is 1997. They haven't pulled the plug on him yet. So it's a hilarious story from Undertaker's perspective. It's a hilarious story in general. But it's crazy that he pulled a David Schultz, where he didn't hit the guy, but he scared the hell out of him, grabbed his tie and intimidated him. Vader ends up spending 10 days under house arrest. He got fined 165 United States dollars for this incident, and it was pretty much left behind in Kuwait, which is crazy, but what else can you do? The show must go on. Vader got himself arrested. But it's good that WWF did what they could to get him out. But that was one of the many things where the guy doesn't have any media training. He has no low impulse control. What can you do? Standing up for the business, that's one thing. But you're in a foreign country. You can't grab their reporters. And I know wrestlers have done this sort of stuff since, and they've done it before. It's never a good idea to put your hands on journalists and these kinds of people because they sue. And you may get arrested, which is what happened to Vader. Anyway, his WWF tenure ends on a very, very low note. His confidence is shredded. He's kind of humiliated himself on the major stage. And they didn't talk about this in any real detail because they wanted to talk a lot about his personal life, which I really appreciated. But he had a career resurgence in All Japan Pro Wrestling. And he ends up becoming one of the few guys who have won the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship as well as the All Japan Pro Wrestling Triple Crown. And he had a really great run in the late 90s after his WWF run to kind of rebuild his confidence. But by this time, physically, he's not the same as he was in 1987. Clearly, it's been over a decade at this point of wrestling and traveling and injuries and all of this. And that was pretty much the swan song of his career, was wrestling in Japan. He made some sporadic returns to the WWF. 2005, I believe, he showed up to have a 3-on-1 handicap match with Batista where he teamed with Goldust and Jonathan Coachman. I remember he popped up, I think, in like 2011 to do some stuff with Heath Slater. So they didn't completely give up on him and throw him in the garbage, never to be heard from again. But he never got that Legends contract. He never got the Hall of Fame while he was still alive. All that stuff was, a big mistake. Vader is legitimately one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time. He is fantastic. If you watch him in his prime, even if you just watch his WCW stuff, you get the idea that he is just tremendous. The WWF, it goes to show that if you screw up at the highest level, that becomes your legacy. This guy won every championship, every major title, and all these other wrestling promotions, but ended up getting pinned by Al Snow in WWF, and that's all people remember. That's terrible, but it's true. Okay, so you have to surf the backwaters of the internet to find people who actually legitimately appreciate Vader. Hell, I don't even really like Japanese wrestling that much, but I love watching like Vader wrestle Inoki and Fujinami. Even the one match he think he had with Bam Bam Bigelow in Japan. I really liked his Japanese stuff. He makes me watch Japanese stuff. Him, Brody, Hansen, guys like that. Of course, the highlight of the documentary was his son and his ex-wife, who did a really good job of humanizing Vader. Like, we've all seen Vader as this larger-than-life character and just this big, massive dude. And then you hear about how doting of a husband he was, how doting of a father he was, and he was kind of oscillating between being Vader and being Leon, and the wife had a problem with Vader being in the house. She wanted Leon in the house. She didn't want Vader in the house. Of course, the really sad end where his son was basically his caregiver for the last few years of his life. But they also mentioned, and I think it's worth talking about, the last real controversy that Vader was involved with was the issue of Will Ospreay in 2016. Vader had seen a clip of Will Ospreay and Ricochet. They were doing pretty much a dance routine in the middle of the ring. It wasn't literally a dance routine, but it was kind of like a Jackie Chan Power Rangers kung fu fight scene in the middle of the ring, and Vader completely disrespected it, called it trash or something like that. This led to him actually wrestling Will Ospreay in Rev Pro at some point in 2016, and apparently Will Ospreay was booked to win that match initially, and then Vader basically said, "I ain't doing it unless I go over," and so Vader won that match. Interesting, but but okay, that was pretty much it. Of course, he died of heart failure. He was 63 years old. Had a hell of a life, hell of a career, man. One of the greatest of all time. His family really elevated this episode of Dark Side of the Ring. I think this was put together with love, I think. Some episodes of Dark Side of the Ring have obvious agendas where it's to destroy the subject. This one, it was to elevate the subject. And a lot of that had to do with how bad people felt about how he was treated in WWF. And people felt like he was treated unfairly by Shawn and Vince and, all the powers that be over there, and that he was a great professional wrestler who, just one of the many great professional wrestlers who didn't work out because of politics and egos, etc. And maybe that's true, but I really liked it because I think it showed the ups and the downs, and I think it was fair in terms of how they approached the subject. They approached the subject appropriately. They talked about Vader being a phenomenal in-ring talent. They talked about him being a bit of a bully, how he could, talk to people in the wrong way, how sometimes he had a bad attitude, how sometimes he would, go after his wife. And, she didn't say he was abusive, but there was obviously some aggression there, but they didn't linger on that. They actually talked to the guy whose back he broke. There's a lot of stuff that they packed into this 45 minutes that I thought this is one of the better episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. It's not as great as the Benoit episode or the Pillman episodes, but it's up there with those as being pretty damn good. But let me know what you guys think. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
Yeah. We're just gonna